One of the things that you do in the book that I think is really cool, it is fiction and you have to make up some dialogue, but anytime that there is, Frank's actual words out there, which fortunately, because of all these interviews, there's a lot compared to,
Yeah,
most of these guys. And, there's footage of them, there's audio of his voice, which, is just
right,
incredible.
right.
So it's really, there's a lot of stuff that's in this book that's actually his words. You didn't have to make that up. But when it came time to start speaking in his voice, sort of the narrator of the story,
Yeah.
how'd you go about that? And what made you want to do a fiction book instead of just like the run of the mill life of Frank Costello? It's kind of out
Okay.
there.
Let me address the first part of that because so everything that he says in public, right, when he's talking to a journalist, uh, it's all from the historical record. So when I write about that press conference that I mentioned, I use his exact words that he said those words in public. It's unbelievable as it seems. He said all those words. Everything that takes place during his testimony is from the public record. And even in court, and even earlier in court, when he was a young man and he was arrested, um, I used the court transcripts. So when you see him talking to a judge or talking to a congressman, I beg your pardon, or talking to a journalist, it's all his words. So when I when I decided to do this, the first thing I did was I read everything I could find, and then I spent a summer doing a timeline of his entire life. It's like 4 pages long. This is what happened. This is what happened. This happened. And I followed the timeline. So in a way, it's easier than writing a novel that you just make up, which I've done, because you always know what's going to happen next because Frank's going to do something else. But you have to decide what to leave out, and there's sort of an art to that a bit. So that I just wanted to say that. And now, how did I decide to tell it in his voice? Well, I thought that there were two great novels by serious writers um, about Frank Costello. So one is Billy Bathgate about the mob, rather. So take two. There are two serious novels about the mob written by very serious, very gifted writers. So one is Billy Bathgate um, by E.L. Doctorow, which is, I think, one of the best post-war American novels ever written. Everybody should read it, but don't read it before my book because it's so good. You want to read my book first. It's really a masterpiece, and it is told in the voice of a young man who gets involved in Dutch Schultz's gang. So Dutch Schultz is the monster, and he really was a monster, right? And then you have a young man observations about Dutch Schultz, right? So it's always a bit removed. It's brilliant. And then there's William Kennedy's Legs about Legs Diamond, and in that book, it's a fiction and it's narrated by his attorney. So Legs Diamond is this guy who's getting shot. He's always he's always going to get killed. Blah blah blah. He's running from the law, and you see what his lawyer's impressions of him. So I thought, and that would be my natural inclination. It's sort of like The Great Gatsby, right? You have Nick Carraway, the sensitive guy, then you have Gatsby over here, and he's fascinated with Gatsby. He writes about Gatsby. So that was my initial inclination to do that, and I thought, well, I wanted this book to be different, so I said I will speak in, I will have the chutzpah to speak in Frank Costello's voice, and that was, in a way, it was very liberating, right? Because if I was writing it in the third person or in a different character as an attorney or something, it sort of had to be like had to be well written, right? I was an English major. I write essays. And so there's always a concern. You don't want cliches. You don't want ungrammatical sentences or anything like that. But if it's written in Frank Costello's voice, it's sort of liberating. It can be very colloquial. Do you know what I mean? You can,
Absolutely.
because you're speaking his voice, and you can say things that you would never say, And I thought that you would, his attitude towards women, his attitude towards, Jewish people or whatever. Things that, I mean, I'm Jewish, but I would never say these things. But I knew, because I wrote the book about boxing, I had interviewed many people who were very intelligent but had grown up on the street in New York City. And so I kind of knew how they spoke. I spent a lot of time with a trainer who had trained Rocky Graziano and Raging Bull. And and he grew up in Greenwich Village. I spent a great deal of time with another trainer who had worked with Joe Louis and Benny Leonard, and they were all born about the same time as Frank. And this guy, the great trainer Ray Arcel, he grew up in East Harlem. He grew up in the Jewish section of East Harlem. So when Frank Costello in the book says, well, we called the Jews Christ killers, Ray Arcel told me that. He said, well, the Italian kids called us Christ killers. So I had those voices in my head. And then I have a friend who's a criminal defense attorney, and he has done a number of mob cases. So sometimes when he's in New York and he's going out to dinner with a defendant or whatever, I'll tag along. So like dinner, I've had dinner at Rayo's, I've had dinner at these other places where these folks congregate, and so I got to hear how they thought about the world and how they spoke about the world, and how they spoke about other people, and how they spoke about law enforcement people, right? And I noticed a number of things. One of which was that they want to bring everyone down to their level, right? So their notion is everybody's a crook, right? But everybody's not a crook, but that's how they see the world, and and they hate prosecutors, right? So I thought, well, he's going to hate Frank Hogan, he's going to hate Kefauver, he's going to, and that was fun, and I thought that would be how he would feel if he were to try to tell the truth. So the idea of the novel is that Frank is old and he's narrating his life, and he wants to tell the truth. Now, Costello before he died, he was going to do a memoir with Peter Moss, right? Is it Peter Moss?
Yeah.
So Moss, who did the Fallaci papers, who would have done, you couldn't think of anyone better to do this book, right, with Frank Costello. Then Costello died. But I read that Peter Moss said that all Frank wanted to talk about was, how legitimate he was, the good things that he'd done. So I think if Frank had written, if Frank wouldn't have been as forthcoming as Peter Moss would have wanted him to be. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I thought, well, this, because it's fiction, that's why I wrote fiction, I had the leeway to in the book, I think you see him trying to say, he's like exposing all his lies. He's trying to tell the truth. He's trying to, and then he sort of fabricates a bit, so he's trying and then he does it, and you think, oh, is this true? And you can tell he's being a little bit evasive, but it's an effort. I thought he was the sort of person who might really wish to make an effort to consider the truth about his life, and this is what it might have been like. So that's sort of the idea. But I think that the voice, it could only exist in a work of fiction, but I tried to be as consistent with the historical record as I was within my power. So, but you would know as well as I do. I mean, I don't know if you found any mistakes.
I thought it was, like I said, I wasn't really sure what to expect when I saw a novel. It could go either way.
Sure.
I'm not one of these people that's, if it's not, completely historical accurate, that I don't like it. I have a little leeway for that stuff. And I think when you're dealing with a subject like this, you can't get everything right. It's, you're dealing with a guy. I've heard every story of Frank Costello from 5 different angles, and they're all
right.
different. And I don't know which is, the longer I've done this, the more I realize I don't believe anything anymore. But
and anybody who was there is, with all due respect, a criminal, right?
Yeah.
So, and what are criminals? They're kind of liars, right? So you can't really rely on them. And it's not like the Harvard history department has gone into this, and you know what I mean? So, and then the books that are written about it tend to romanticize and make up stuff. Like the quote unquote memoir of Lucky Luciano, the last testament of Luciano. Well, that book has been exposed as a fraud. And yet you see it quoted everywhere. Right? You read a seemingly serious book and there's a footnote. Lucky said this, and you think, where did that come from? You look at the footnote, the Last Testament of Luciano. Well, read the new, Google, is the Last Testament of Lucky is it accurate? No, it's not. It was exposed as a fraud.
Yeah, it's got a lot of inaccuracies in there that I even just on Frank Costello when he's. First of all, they're like what I was saying. I enjoyed that read. I think it's a great book to read.
It's a great work of fiction.
But if they would have just said it was fiction, then no problem. It would be a classic, I think.